This is a work of alternate historical fiction. All characters, events and situations in this story are fictional and are not intended to represent real historical events. Winter had settled over the endless Kazakh steppe like a heavy white blanket. The wind moved across the frozen grasslands without mercy, carrying snow that erased all tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. Villages were small, scattered across the vast land, where every family depended on one another to survive the harsh season. In one of those villages lived 18-year-old Arman with his parents and younger sister Aygul. Their home was simple, a clay house with a warm stove in the center and thick felt rugs covering the floor. They owned only a few sheep, 2 horses and enough grain to survive until spring if they used it carefully. Like every family, they had already given much to the war. Arman's older brother had left years earlier to join the Soviet army. No letters had arrived for months.
Every evening, Arman's mother prepared tea while his father stared silently into the fire. No one spoke much anymore. War had a way of making silence feel louder than words. One evening, after a heavy snowstorm, Arman rode his horse toward the frozen river to check on several sheep that had wandered away. The cold stung his face and the wind made it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. Then he noticed something unusual. A dark shape lay half buried beneath the snow. At first he believed it was a fallen tree, then it moved. Arman carefully approached, keeping one hand on the reins. As he came closer, he saw a young man wearing a torn grey military coat. His boots were frozen solid and blood had stained one sleeve. The stranger's lips were blue, his breathing was weak. Arman immediately recognized the uniform, German. His heart began to race. Every story he had heard during the war warned people never to trust enemy soldiers. Some committed terrible crimes. Others fought only because they had been forced into uniform. Standing in the middle of the frozen steppe, Arman had no way of knowing which kind of man lay before him. The stranger slowly opened his eyes. Please, he whispered in broken Russian. I don't want to die. Those words surprised Arman. There was no hatred in the man's voice, only exhaustion. Arman hesitated. If he helped the stranger, his family could be accused of aiding an enemy. If he left him there, the man would almost certainly freeze before nightfall. His father had always told him something that his grandfather believed. Before you ask where a traveler comes from, ask whether he is hungry. Arman climbed from his horse. He offered the stranger water. The man drank only a few drops before coughing. My name, Lucas, he said quietly. I was a medical assistant. I never joined the party. I only wanted to study medicine. Arman understood only part of what he said, but he understood fear. Using every bit of strength he had, Arman lifted Lucas onto the horse. The ride home felt endless. Each minute Arman expected someone to stop him. No one did. When they reached the village after sunset, his father opened the door. His expression immediately changed. You brought a German? Arman nodded. He would have died. His father remained silent for a long moment. Finally he stepped aside. Bring him inside. His mother quickly heated water while Aygul gathered clean blankets. They carefully removed the frozen coat. The wound in Lucas's arm looked infected but not fatal. His mother cleaned it gently. Lucas repeatedly whispered the same word, Danke. He seemed embarrassed every time someone helped him. For 2 days he barely spoke. He slept almost constantly. Whenever he woke, he apologized. He expected to be treated like a prisoner. Instead, Arman's family gave him soup, bread, warm tea, and medicine made from herbs gathered during the previous summer. On the 3rd evening, Lucas finally found enough strength to speak. I was born near Dresden, he said slowly. My father repaired clocks. My mother taught music. I wanted to become a doctor, he paused. When the war came, everything changed. Arman listened quietly. Lucas explained that refusing military service had not truly been a choice for many young men. Some believed the government's promises. Others feared punishment. Some simply wanted to protect their families. I don't hate Russians. I don't hate Kazakhs. I don't hate anyone. I only want this war to end. The room fell silent. Outside, snow continued falling. Arman's father finally spoke. War teaches men to forget they are human. My father taught me the opposite. Over the next week, Lucas slowly recovered. He insisted on helping despite his injury. He chopped wood, he repaired broken tools. Using skills he had learned from his father, he even fixed an old pocket watch that had stopped years earlier.
Little by little, trust replaced fear. Aigul laughed for the first time in months when Lucas attempted to pronounce difficult Kazakh words. His accent was terrible. Everyone laughed, including Lucas. For a brief moment, the war felt far away. One afternoon, Lucas noticed an elderly shepherd limping badly after sleeping on ice. Without hesitation, he examined the injury. Although he had little equipment, he carefully wrapped the damaged ankle using clean cloth and wooden splints. The old shepherd recovered surprisingly quickly. Word quietly spread through the village. The wounded German healed people instead of harming them. Still, danger remained. Not everyone would understand. One cold evening, a rider arrived from a neighboring settlement. He brought news that military patrols had begun searching villages for escaped prisoners and missing soldiers. The room immediately became tense. Armand's father looked toward Lucas. "You cannot stay forever." Lucas lowered his head. "I know. I never wanted to bring danger here."
That night, no one slept well. Outside, wolves howled across the frozen steppe. Inside, every creak of the wooden walls sounded like approaching footsteps. Armand stared into the darkness. He had rescued a stranger because he believed no one deserved to freeze alone. Now he wondered whether that single decision would change every life inside the little house. Far beyond the village, beneath the pale winter moon, several riders slowly crossed the snow-covered plains. They carried rifles, they carried orders, and they were riding toward the village. This story is a work of alternate historical fiction. All characters, events and situations are fictional and are not intended to represent real historical events. The first light of dawn had barely touched the frozen steppe when Armand climbed onto the roof of the stable. From there he could see almost every path leading towards the village. The snow reflected the pale morning sun, making the empty land appear peaceful. But peace was an illusion. The riders his family had feared the previous night were now only a few kilometers away. Inside the house, Lucas sat quietly beside the stove. His injured arm had healed enough for him to move without pain, yet his face carried the weight of a man who believed he had already caused too much suffering. "I should leave," he said softly. Armand's mother shook her head. "You would not survive long in this weather. I cannot stay either." No one answered. Armand's father slowly poured tea into 5 small cups. "When the storm comes," he said, "running across the open steppe is not always the answer." The words were simple, but everyone understood. Aigul looked at Lucas. "Will the war ever end?" He smiled sadly. "I hope so." He remembered the university books he had left behind before being called into military service. He remembered his father's tiny workshop where broken clocks returned to life under careful hands. He remembered music drifting through the windows while his mother practiced the piano. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Outside, the sound of horses echoed across the frozen ground. The riders entered the village shortly before noon. Their leader introduced himself only as Captain Sokolov. He explained that they were searching for escaped soldiers and anyone who might threaten the safety of nearby settlements. The villagers answered their questions carefully. Most truly knew nothing. Others simply hoped the search would end quickly. Meanwhile, Lucas remained hidden in a small storage room beneath stacks of wool blankets and grain sacks. The air was cold and every sound from outside seemed louder than it really was. He heard boots, voices, doors opening. His heartbeat became almost unbearable. "If they find me," he whispered to himself, "I will tell them no one helped willingly." Above him, Armand tried to remain calm. Captain Sokolov entered the house. "You have enough food for the winter?" "We manage," Armand's father replied. The captain looked around. His eyes rested briefly on an extra bowl that had not yet been put away. Armand's mother quietly picked it up. "We had neighbors visiting this morning." The explanation sounded ordinary. Still, the captain studied the room for another long moment. Finally, he nodded. "We will continue." The patrol left. Only after the sound of horses disappeared did Lucas emerge from hiding. "I owe you my life again." Armand's father answered calmly. "No. You owe us a promise." "What promise?" "If this war ever ends, remember that kindness can exist even in the darkest times." Lucas lowered his head. "I promise."
Days passed, the patrol did not return. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the land. Small streams appeared beneath the melting snow, and the first birds returned from the south. Lucas spent every day helping the villagers. He repaired broken farming tools using scraps of metal. He treated cuts, burns, and fevers with the limited medical knowledge he possessed. He never accepted payment. Whenever someone thanked him, he always gave the same answer: "You saved me first." Even those who had distrusted him at first slowly changed their minds. One elderly shepherd told Arman quietly, "When I was young, my father said a man's character is shown by how he treats strangers. I understand his words now." Yet Lucas never forgot who he was. Every evening he sat outside alone, looking toward the western horizon. Somewhere beyond thousands of kilometers lay the home he might never see again. One afternoon, a young boy from a neighboring family fell through the thin ice covering a narrow river. By the time adults reached him, the child was barely breathing. Lucas immediately took charge. He wrapped the boy in dry blankets, he warmed water, he instructed everyone to keep the child awake while gradually raising his body temperature. Hours later, the boy opened his eyes. His mother burst into tears. She embraced Lucas without saying a word. For the first time since arriving in the village, Lucas smiled without sadness. Perhaps, he thought, saving even one life could give meaning to everything he had lost. But the steppe never allowed hope to remain unchallenged for long. Near sunset, a lone traveler arrived with troubling news. More military units had been seen moving through the region. Searches would become stricter. Villages would be questioned again. This time, hiding would be far more difficult. That evening, Arman's family gathered around the stove. "We cannot keep living in fear," Aygul whispered. Arman's father nodded. There may soon come a day when Lucas must continue his journey. Silence filled the room. No one wanted to imagine that day. Lucas looked at every member of the family who had welcomed him when he had been nothing more than a frozen stranger lying beneath the snow. "I arrived here with nothing," he said quietly. "You gave me food. You gave me warmth. But most importantly, you reminded me that war cannot destroy humanity unless people allow it to." Outside, the wind carried the last snowflakes of winter across the endless steppe. Far away, another column of riders appeared against the fading light. This time, they were moving much faster than before. The story is a work of alternate historical fiction. All characters, events, and situations are fictional and are not intended to represent real historical events. The riders arrived before sunrise. Unlike the previous patrol, these men did not stop to greet the villagers or ask polite questions. They searched every barn, every shed, and every wagon. Their horses were tired, their uniforms covered in dust and melting snow, and their commander wore the expression of someone who trusted no one. Arman watched from the doorway as soldiers moved from house to house. "They're searching everything," he whispered. Lucas already knew what that meant. "If they find me," he said quietly, "I will tell them that I forced my way here. Your family must not suffer because of me." Arman's father looked directly at him. No, Lucas was surprised. "You are our guest." The old man spoke calmly, but every word carried weight. "In this house, we do not abandon guests." For a moment, no one spoke. Then a knock echoed through the house. 3 soldiers entered. They searched every room carefully. One opened cupboards, another inspected the stable. The commander questioned Arman's father about travelers, merchants, and strangers. "We have seen no one unusual," he answered. The officer studied his face, searching for hesitation. Finding none, he finally ordered his men to continue. When they left, everyone remained silent for several minutes, listening until the sound of boots disappeared. Only then did Aygul release the breath she had been holding. "They're gone." Lucas closed his eyes. "I have taken enough from all of you." That evening he made his decision. "I must leave." "No," Arman answered immediately. "If I stay," Lucas replied, "your family will always be in danger." His words were impossible to argue with. After a long discussion, they agreed that Arman would accompany him for part of the journey east, toward a remote settlement where Lucas hoped he might eventually surrender safely as the fighting moved farther away. Before sunrise, they prepared quietly. Arman's mother packed flatbread, dried meat, cheese, and a small leather bag filled with herbs. "You may not need these," she told Lucas, "but perhaps someone else will." He accepted the bag with both hands. "I will never forget this."
The two young men rode across the endless steppe beneath a pale grey sky. For hours they saw nothing except snow, scattered rocks, and distant hills. Conversation came slowly. Finally, Arman asked, "Were you always interested in medicine?" Lucas smiled. "When I was a child, I was fascinated by how the human body could heal itself. My father repaired clocks. My mother taught music, and I wanted to repair people. What happened? The war." Nothing more needed to be said. Late that afternoon, they found an abandoned shepherd's shelter beside a frozen stream. Inside, they built a small fire. While eating their simple meal, Arman asked another question. "Do you think people will ever stop fighting wars?" Lucas stared into the flames. "I don't know. But I believe every act of kindness makes the next war a little less likely." The wind howled outside throughout the night. The following morning, they resumed their journey. Around midday, they noticed smoke rising in the distance. Approaching carefully, they discovered a broken wagon. Beside it sat an elderly couple and a young girl. One horse had been injured after sleeping on icy ground. The family had been stranded for nearly 2 days. Without hesitation, Lucas examined the horse, while Arman repaired part of the damaged harness. Together, they managed to free the animal and strengthen the wagon enough for the family to continue traveling. The old man offered them money. Lucas politely refused. "Help someone else when they need it." The old man nodded. "I will." As the family disappeared across the steppe, Armand looked at Lucas. "You always help people." Lucas answered quietly, "I couldn't stop the war, but I can still choose who I become." 3 days passed before they reached a line of low hills overlooking a broad valley. There, their paths would separate. Beyond the valley lay villages neither of them knew. Perhaps safety, perhaps new dangers, no one could say. Arman removed a small wooden carving from his pocket. It was a tiny horse his grandfather had carved years earlier. "I want you to keep this." Lucas looked surprised. "I can't." "You can. So you'll remember our home." Lucas accepted the carving carefully, turning it over in his hands. "I have nothing equal to give." He reached into his coat and removed a worn pocket watch. It no longer kept perfect time, but its brass cover had been polished countless times over the years. "My father repaired this many times."
"It belonged to my grandfather. I want you to have it." Arman hesitated. "This is your family." "So are memories," Lucas replied. "And now, this watch carries new ones." The two young men stood silently. Months earlier, they had been complete strangers. Now, they embraced like brothers. "I hope we meet again," Arman said. "So do I." Lucas adjusted the small backpack on his shoulders and began walking toward the distant valley. After only a few steps, he turned back. "Tell your family," he paused, "that because of them, I remembered what humanity looks like." Arman watched until Lucas became a tiny figure against the endless landscape. Only then did he begin the long ride home. Neither of them knew whether they would ever meet again, but both carried something that could not be measured by maps, uniforms, or borders. They carried hope. And sometimes, in the darkest years, hope was the strongest thing a person could possess. This story is a work of alternate historical fiction. All characters, events, and situations are fictional and are not intended to represent real historical events. Spring slowly awakened the endless steppe. The snow that had covered the plains for months disappeared beneath warm sunlight, revealing green grass and small wildflowers. Rivers that had been frozen only weeks before now rushed through the valleys, carrying melted snow toward distant lakes. Arman often climbed the same hill where he had said goodbye to Lucas. Each time he looked toward the western horizon, each time the land answered only with silence. Back in the village, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Sheep grazed once again, children laughed in the streets, and families repaired homes that winter storms had damaged. Yet everyone remembered the quiet stranger who had arrived beneath the snow. The elderly shepherd's ankle had fully healed. The young boy who had fallen into the icy river now ran faster than ever. Even the broken pocket watch that Lucas had repaired still rested on the shelf in Arman's home, ticking softly every evening. Months passed. One afternoon, a merchant stopped in the village while traveling across the steppe. As people gathered around his wagon to trade flour, wool, and leather, he shared stories from distant settlements. There was a young foreign medic, the merchant said. He traveled from village to village, helping anyone who was sick or injured. Armand's heart skipped. What happened to him? No one knows for certain, the merchant replied. Some say he eventually reached a military camp and surrendered peacefully. Others believe he continued east, treating civilians wherever he could. There was no way to know which story was true, but Armand smiled anyway. He hoped at least one of them was. That evening his father placed another log on the fire. Sometimes, he said, we never learn how a story truly ends. His mother nodded. That does not make kindness meaningless. Weeks later, Armand found himself repairing a fence near the edge of the village when two exhausted travelers arrived with an injured child. The girl's leg had been cut by a broken wagon wheel. Without hesitation, Armand remembered everything Lucas had taught him. He cleaned the wound with boiled water. He wrapped it with clean cloth. He calmed the frightened child while her parents watched anxiously. It will heal, Armand said. The father thanked him repeatedly. After the family left, Aygul smiled. He taught you well. Armand looked toward the open steppe. No, he answered quietly. He reminded me to help first and ask questions later. As summer approached, the village elders gathered beneath the shade of a large tree. They spoke about harvests, livestock, and rebuilding after another difficult year. Before the meeting ended, the oldest elder stood. There is something we should remember. Everyone became silent. Years from now, people may forget our names. They may forget our houses. They may even forget this village. But never let them forget that compassion is stronger than fear. No one applauded, they simply nodded. Some lessons did not require loud voices. Late one evening, Armand removed the small wooden box that held the old brass pocket watch. He wound it gently. Tick, tick, tick. Each movement of the hands reminded him that time continued forward even after loss. Inside the box lay a folded piece of paper. It was the only note Lucas had left before beginning his journey. Its handwriting was careful but uneven. It read, "If we survive this terrible age, let us build a future where children know one another as neighbors before they know one another as enemies." Armand folded the paper again. Outside, the warm summer wind crossed the steppe. For the first time in many months, he no longer looked toward the horizon with sadness. Instead, he looked with hope. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, he believed his friend was alive. And whether they met again or not, the promise they had made to one another remained unchanged. To remember that even in the darkest times, every act of mercy could become the beginning of peace. The story, however, was not yet over. Years would pass before fate offered them one final chance to meet again. This story is a work of alternate historical fiction. All characters, events, and situations are fictional and are not intended to represent real historical events. Many years passed. The war became a chapter in history, but its memories remained alive in those who had survived it. Across the vast steppe, villages were rebuilt, one house at a time. Children who had once hidden from distant gunfire grew into adults who knew peace better than fear. Armand had become the village's most respected craftsman. He repaired wagons, built homes, and helped neighbors whenever they needed an extra pair of hands. The old brass pocket watch never left his workbench. Though its case had become scratched with age, it still marked each passing hour with the same steady rhythm. Every spring, Armand climbed the same hill overlooking the endless grasslands. Not because he expected someone to appear, but because it reminded him that one decision made on a snowy afternoon had changed two lives forever. His parents had grown older, Aygul had married and now had children of her own. Around the family table, stories were often told, not about battles or victories, but about courage, compassion, and the importance of seeing another person's humanity. One autumn morning, a traveler arrived in the village. He carried only a backpack, a walking stick, and a weathered leather notebook. His hair had turned grey around the temples, though he could not have been much older than Armand. The traveler asked quietly, "Does a man named Armand still live here?" The villagers pointed toward the workshop. Armand looked up from repairing a wooden wheel. The stranger smiled. "You still keep busy." The voice was older, calmer, but unmistakable. "Lucas?" For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then they embraced like brothers who had been separated by an entire lifetime. "You survived," Armand whispered. "So did you." They sat together outside the workshop until sunset, sharing tea while the village gathered nearby, curious about the visitor. Lucas explained that after leaving the village years earlier, he had reached a military medical station where he surrendered peacefully. Because he had served as a medic and later helped civilians, his path after the war eventually led back to medicine. "I became the doctor I once dreamed of becoming," Arman smiled. "I always believed you would." Lucas opened his notebook. Inside were dozens of names of villages, families, children, patients. "Every place that showed me kindness," he said, "I wrote down so I would never forget." Near the end of the notebook was a familiar name, Arman's village. "I promised your father I would remember. I kept that promise." The following day, Lucas visited the elderly shepherd whose ankle he had treated many years before. The old man walked with a cane now, but his smile was bright.
"I never thought I would see you again," he laughed. Children followed Lucas through the village, fascinated by his stories of distant places. He showed them simple first aid techniques and explained why helping others mattered more than hatred. One evening, the villagers gathered for a shared meal beneath the open sky. The stars stretched across the heavens exactly as they had on the winter night when Lucas had first arrived. Arman's father, now frail but still sharp-minded, slowly stood. "When we are young," he said, "we think history is made only by armies and governments." He looked around the table. "But history is also shaped by ordinary people, by families who choose kindness, by strangers who refuse to forget each other's humanity." Silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence, a grateful one. Before Lucas departed once again, he handed Arman a small wooden box. Inside rested a carefully repaired pocket watch. Its hands moved smoothly, its brass cover shone once more. "I restored it completely," Lucas said with a smile. "It belongs here." Arman reached into his own pocket. Wrapped in a small cloth was the tiny carved wooden horse his grandfather had made decades earlier. "I kept its twin," he said. "I carved another one after you left." He placed it into Lucas's hand. "So wherever you go, part of this village goes with you." Lucas closed his fingers around the carving. "I will treasure it." The next morning, as the sun rose over the endless steppe, Lucas prepared to leave. There were hospitals that needed doctors, communities that needed healing, young students who wanted to learn medicine. Before mounting the wagon that would carry him onward, he turned one last time. "When people ask me what I learned during the darkest years of my life," he said, "I will tell them this. Compassion does not belong to one nation, mercy does not wear a uniform, and hope can begin with something as simple as sharing bread with a stranger." Arman watched until the wagon disappeared beyond the rolling hills. This time there was no sadness, only gratitude. Years later, when Arman became an old man himself, children often asked about the small brass watch displayed above his fireplace. He would smile before answering. "It reminds me that every hour gives us a choice. We can answer fear with fear, or we can answer it with kindness." Outside, the wind continued its endless journey across the steppe, carrying with it stories that no book could fully contain. Some stories were about battles, others were about victories. But the most important stories were about the quiet moments when ordinary people chose compassion over hatred. Those were the stories worth remembering. And across the endless horizon, where earth met sky, the memory of one winter's act of kindness lived on, not as a tale of war, but as a reminder that humanity can endure even in the darkest of times. The end.